There's a couple things I want to explain before I start. This isn't a talk where I develop one line of argument. It's something, it's very much a work in progress. It's something where I'm actually looking for a different way of doing things, of talking about the relationship between Islam, Islamism, and America or Americanism. And you have two different kinds of discussions. One of them I find very uninteresting, and that's the kind of clash of civilization discussion that just pits Islam and America against each other, Islam and the West. And it's a discussion that really doesn't lead anywhere and is based on very bad history, cultural studies, and so forth. So that's a very uninteresting discussion, even though there's a lot of it going on. Except as a myth. In that way, it is very interesting. The second discussion is you have a lot of discussion now into what should be American foreign policy, how should America approach the Islamic world, what should be the Islamic world's look and approach and response to America, and so forth. And that's a fairly practical, it's often sociological, looking at how terrorist networks work, looking at what's going on in politics in different kinds of Islamic countries, doing lots of polling of the Islamic world. And that's a very, more or less sociological, politicological kind of discussion about the relationship. And I also don't want to do that. I think it's very useful, and so you can keep it in the back of your mind as I'm doing my talk, and it's meant to be complementary to what I'm doing. What I'm interested in is trying to figure out how to talk about the other aspect of the relationship. There's a lot of exchange between different parts of the world. And the ways in which that exchange is happening is changing very quickly. And it ties together areas that have been tied together in other ways in the past, like, for example, religion and politics. So you get questions about what is religion, what is politics, what's the role of culture in that, and how is it that we should understand what's going on. And so I want to figure out how to do a more cultural critical kind of discussion of the relation between America and Islam than the kinds of discussions that I'm seeing. So what you're going to see in this talk is me approaching this question from different angles. And I kind of stack them on top of each other. Sometimes I relate them better, sometimes I don't relate them. That's something for the discussion. But that's what you're seeing me doing. So if you start getting lost, that's okay. It's supposed to work as a mosaic. It's supposed to work in relation to each other. There's different parts to the talk. The second thing is the explanation of the title. Americanism and Islamism as kissing kin. The people who aren't American, I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, kissing kin are a family that you don't know well, but that is close enough to kiss when you meet them at family occasions. So it's distant family, it can be unknown family, but still family, and with a kind of intimacy to it that both forces and enables kissing. And that's something I'm going to come back to at the end in a little bit more concrete way. But I first want to start with the metaphor. Let's see now. And just to keep in mind about all the ambivalences and the complexities that we have about families. Now, what do I mean about Americanism? Americanism, most simply what I mean, is the self-sacralization of America, which is to say that the authority authorizing America becomes the greater America. A simple example, if you're in the United States, often you'll see that when there's criticisms of what America is doing abroad, those criticisms are made in the name of higher American ideals. So what happens is you very quickly get into a discussion where you're critiquing America in the name of America. So American ideals to which the country is expected to live up to. It's a circular discussion, it's a critique of America in the name of America, and in a situation in which America is both judge and judged, both abstraction and immanence, both authority and authorized. This slippage between America as authority and authorized runs parallel to a second slippage between America as a specific nation state and America as the world. If you're looking historically now, from the beginning, the line dividing America from the world has never been clear. The fundamental ambivalence of America lies in the fact that while it's been clearly bounded as a location, as a territory, even as those boundaries have changed, of course, with expansion, conquest, and so forth, the idea of America is unbounded. It both imagined itself as taking in the world into itself and as remaking that world, as absorbing the world and being absorbed by it. In 1782 already, the American poet Philip Freneau imagined a North American empire that would create a brotherhood of nations by dispersing the wealth of the New World to all the four corners of the world. 12 years later, Timothy Dwight would inspire New England with his poetic vision of a world blissfully liberated, mankind renovated by an American expansion. And then here's his poem. This expansion would, quote, spread American freedom to the Asian Sea, over plains of slaughter and over wilds of fear. Towns, cities shall lift their towery pride, and starred ensign court Korean gales. So you're going to hear from the East Coast directly over to Asia. Tartar desert shall hail the rising day, and from long torpor China wake. Well, that's happened. Her chains of misery roused Peruvia break, manly to man with bosom twine, and one great bond the house of Adam join. The sacred promise, full completion know, and peace and piety the world overflow. So that was in 1794. Even in such a simple early poem, the fundamental components of America's national global narrative are already present, and you see these come back over and over. That link territorial movement to the spread of ideas and ideals, that conceive of the enemy not as a specific historical people, but as an abstracted, negative way of life to be conquered and displaced, that mark territorial accumulation and ideological dispersal by architectonic development, and that take as America's destiny the liberation and socio-spiritual unification of mankind, and conceptualize this as at once a worldly material task, a natural imperative, and a divine promise. So you see this promise, and I think you can see this very regularly if you've been following the elections, if you listen to Bush, if you listen to State of the Union, and many of these American addresses bring these things together, also in Obama's, a number of Obama's speeches. In its most positive version, this has been the Wilsonian vision, as it inspired not only the League of Nations just after World War I, but dozens of anti-colonial movements who took Wilson's vision of global equality and the universal right to self-determination literally after World War I. In its most grotesque version, this has been the neoconservative Bush doctrine, as it threw aside centuries of international convention and more recent human rights law in the interest of criminal world domination. Here I'm going to go back for a moment to the French Revolution. 5 months before he was beheaded, the French revolutionary Robespierre argued that virtue without terror was useless. This was the political morality of the revolution, he said, a revolution in the name of just law and the universal rights of man. In the 5 months between when Robespierre wrote that and when he was beheaded, some 10,000 men and women were killed, lawlessly, ruthlessly, and arbitrarily. The victims not so much of this or that particular ideology, but of the intensifying power struggle among different revolutionary factions. So this reminds us when we forget how easily the modern desire for justice gives birth to terrorism, and that the modern ideal of universal human rights has from the beginning been used to argue for their violation. The crucial point is that Robespierre's argument that virtue without terror is useless is of course a deeply strategic, rationalist, Machiavellian one that recognizes the political utility of terror. And at the same time, this is what we might call a theological insight, which recognizes that the point of revolutionary virtue is to achieve a rupture with the immanent, with the hard material facts on the ground, in the interest of achieving a utopia that until that moment has only been imagined. This utopia whose virtue will redeem the very violence that was necessary to achieve it. At the same time, that violence itself contains a redemptive function, precisely because it requires the sacrifice of virtue on the part of the revolutionary for the sake of the revolution. So this is important to recognize, that what we often take as the origin of modernity contains within itself not only the birth of modern terror, but also the theology of modern politics. This all sounds very abstract, and so when I was writing this, I thought of a film I saw a couple days ago, Ang Lee's Lust, Caution. How many of you have seen that? I'm curious. Okay, not that many, a few, a handful. Well, it's a story about the Japanese. It's during the war, World War II, and the Japanese are occupying China. And there's a man who is a Chinese man who's collaborating with the Chinese. And there's a young group of students who decides that they want to assassinate him. And how they want to do this is by having one of them begin an affair with him, and that will provide them with the opportunity for killing him. Now, the woman who agrees to have the affair with him is a virgin, and at the same time, when she goes to bed with him, she discovers that he's very violent. He has a very violent lovemaking style. But she agrees to submit to this so that the relationship can develop and so he can be assassinated. So she agrees to the sacrifice of her virtue, which isn't just sexual, but emotional and moral, to the point of transforming her from the inside out. She falls in love with him and his sexual violence, in the understanding that the killing of the traitor will redeem this transformation, which, at least in classic modernist terms, is also a self-violation. Now, it's more complicated in this, in the film itself, because it's very ambivalent also how the man sees himself and his role, and what the relationship, there's a lot of nuance and slippage between the two of them. But this is the basic modern revolutionary trope, which is also at the same time a theological trope, pimping the self, playing the whore as individual or as nation state for the greater good. Now this brings me to another entry point, and that's witchcraft. And I can only hint at what I'm trying to do, but we can see during the discussion. Popular culture often associates witchcraft and witchcraft trials with the Middle Ages, but this is quite inaccurate. In the Middle Ages, according to official church policy, witchcraft was considered a form of superstition, a false belief, a figment of the imagination. It was only in early modernity that both the church position towards witchcraft and the actual conception of witchcraft changed dramatically. Traditionally, witchcraft would be good or bad, and referred to a technical process, more or less, by which an individual intervened in order to affect the outcome of nature or divine processes. By the 14th century, following the persecution of different groups for heresy, the emphasis shifted from the process to the person, from witchcraft to the witch. And the witch now was someone who had made a pact with the devil, worshipping this devil in a way that was the mirror opposite of good religion. White was black, up was down, and included the eating of unbaptized babies' flesh for the heretical sacrament. Women in particular were thought to be susceptible to this because women were insatiable sexually, and therefore always potential prey to the devil and to seduction. And I have here now the first image that was made, the first representation of witches. So this is from 1514, and this is the first, in modern art, the first representation of witches. And he has a number of other pictures of them, and they're actually quite different. And these are all by the same artist. It's Hans Bildung Green. And what's important to notice is the nakedness of the women. And there's a doubleness here, an ambivalence, because it indicates their sexuality, their witchiness, but it also becomes a setting in which to represent the naked female form and its attractiveness. So these different images of witches aren't only about perversion, but also about the beauty of female sensuality, about the interplay between repulsion and attraction. Now, in terms of what the topic of the paper is, there are two other points that are important. What really helped the spread of anti-witchcraft hysteria was the publication of a book. which was called the Malleus Maleficus, the witch's hammer. And this was a witch hunting manual that spread throughout Europe, and it created, in its spread and in people's application of this book, this was one of the first books that was printed using the new book printing culture. It created an imagined community in the space of witchcraft and its repression, and at the same time it rationalized the discovery and the persecution of witches. So what you have is that this is a manual which explains very clearly in different sections and in different processes what witches are, the kinds of witches that there are, the kinds of practices that they engage in, how they can be tested, and so forth. So it's a very scientific application. So what you're having is you're going from a time in the Middle Ages when witches, belief in witchcraft and in witches was considered simply a superstition, to, as you enter the modern time period, a much more developed sense of witches as individuals that need to be disciplined in a very scientific fashion. And so that is to say, witchcraft and the repression of women and of sexuality becomes the main means both to nation, to imagined community, and to science. In this way, the religious and the modern national are, of course, deeply interconnected. You might say, in rather devilish or witch-like fashion, the theological seduces the modern national and political. The second aspect to remember is that to this day, modern society retains its terror of and its self-definition through witches. Most generally, we know that modern society, however rationalized, is deeply susceptible to moral panics. Moral panics that time and again are legitimated by scientific regimes of knowledge production and suspicion that all too often locate heretical witchery in the body of the hunted object. And here I'm thinking specifically in terms of the kinds of research I'm doing in what the response has been to Islam and to Muslims. So you see this huge explosion of books looking at what is Islam, what is the Quran, how do we read it, what is the content of it. Huge, huge production of knowledge about Islam and Muslims, but that is coming from questions that are actually very, very different than the kinds of questions that Muslims have themselves asked about themselves and about their texts and so forth. When you look, for example, at hearings in the United States Senate, the Senate hearings, they ask experts to come in and tell them all about radical Islam and so forth. The experts who come in are themselves also Americans who themselves are not Muslim and have not been in Muslim circles. So you have Euro-American Americans asking questions about Muslims to people who are neither Muslim nor coming from the Middle East, but are there as the most trustworthy experts on the subject. So the ways in which you have a kind of circular knowledge production is something that happens time and again when you have these moments of moral panic, where the knowledge that gets produced is the knowledge that you already have. In other words, deeply embedded in the modern rationalized nation state is the witch hunt and all its associated theology. So this is what brings me back to America. If you look at America, at first sight it seems like it has nothing to do with this, with terror and witchcraft and so forth. For example, the American Revolution, it had its share of brutality and violence and excess, but it didn't have anything like the universal terror that you had with the French Revolution, the mass murder that just went all over the place. But what you might consider is that this could be because in America the terror didn't follow but preceded the revolution. That the terror began when there were created two apart classes of people, the Indian and the African slave, against whom all forms of lawlessness and inhumanity would be practiced, sometimes arbitrarily and at other times with evil and sadistic calculation. While throughout they were subject to the law, it was a law that as often as not either deprived them of full humanity or the recognition that is the essence of democracy and social existence, or simply a law that was set aside when it was inconvenient. That is, in America, the effect of the socio-racial divide was to create two political spaces. On the one hand, the realm of democratization, and on the other hand, the realm of terror. And ever since then, to borrow the words of Du Bois, America has been two souls in one body. So one could imagine that America's democracy was untainted by the French excess, by the French terror, only because in America that excess played out in a space that was by convention and necessity declared to be beyond the space of democracy, beyond politics, beyond the pale. At the same time, this division has not been absolute, and a lot of the public debate that you have in America comes back to this question again and again. Where do you draw a line? Where is the line of freedom and democracy? What is to be the place where democracy is deployed, and where is it to be suspended? And you see the most obvious examples of that, most recently, of course, in Guantanamo, and with the argument that this is a space that is outside the realm of American law, and that the individuals there are outside the space of international law. So the rules of habeas corpus and democracy and so forth, and the just rule of law are not valid. To the extent that America identifies itself with democracy, this problematic is also at the heart of the question of America's practice in the world. Where to draw the line of America? Now this whole mixing of terror and democracy, the dividing of space into the realm of ethics and of violence, you see obviously in a lot of what's been going on. But there are two other things that I want to remark. First, this involves the projection when you're looking at what's going on with America internationally. It involves the projection of America's internal dynamic onto the world. And what I'm thinking about here is that there's been a lot of discussion. Often America is described as being imperialist. And that's in general terms, of course, that works in the sense that America is projecting its force, its control, its influence in all sorts of ways onto other realms beyond its territorial borders in its own interest. So in those very general terms, you can say that it's imperialist or acting colonizing. At the same time, there's a different logic to it. And one aspect, because it's not about either gaining territory, it's not about gaining a kind of structural, institutional control, unilateral control over other areas. There's a lot of ambivalence in the whole notion of bringing democracy to another place, in the hope, in the expectation that that democracy will be the same as what you have at home, but always with the risk that it won't be. And one other aspect that's very important is that in the process of doing this, what you see happening is that America exports its internal logic, its internal racial logic, its internal divisions between terror and democracy onto, excuse me, the realm outside of it. This is a process that's been going on, especially since the end of the First World War, the influence of Wilson's 14 Points, where you see this same kind of contradiction, where Wilson, on the one hand, what was so important about Wilson, if you're not familiar with his 14 Points, was one of the key issues was that Wilson said that everyone has a right to self-determination. So this was the first time that this idea of the universal right to self-determination had been launched, and Wilson became world famous, and for a short time he was a huge hero wherever he went. And so people all over the world, in Egypt and India and China and so forth, were very interested in having this right to self-determination be recognized at Versailles, at the treaty discussions. But Wilson actually was not very interested in it. So he made an argument that found a huge global audience, but then at the same time was not at all actually interested in that global audience and took his European audience much more seriously. So there's on the one hand this Wilsonian universalism, and on the other hand still this clear division between what is the realm of democracy and what is the other, what is beyond that realm. This is the logic of the frontier, and within the framework of the frontier narrative, what's important to note is the highly contradictory place given to the Indian. On the one hand, the Indian is absolutely and overwhelmingly present as the threatening other who might strike at any moment and must be overcome, so that America itself is not overcome. And this is something you see if you read narratives from the original settling of America, and this continual sense of the presence of the Indian, whether or not you see him. So whether or not, irrespective of whether there are actual Indians present, it's a continual fear. And at the same time, the Indian is entirely absent, both in the form of an absence of Indian self-representation and in those representations of America as an empty, fertile land waiting to be made livable by the arrival of Europeans. Under globalization, this entails the globalization of America, and the whole world is transformed into the American frontier. And one of the things that's very striking in terms of the war against terrorism, there's a number of books that have been written about it, and one of them is called Assassin's Gate by George Packer. And he talks about that wherever he goes to any of the American bases, at some point somebody will say to him, "Welcome to Indian country." So there's this ongoing discursive sense that this is Indian country, this is the site of encountering the Indian among the soldiers, the American military, who is stationed throughout the world. To be welcome to Indian country is to be welcome to the American frontier as it transcends place and time. It is to make the frontier a state of mind, an identity, and a logic of power and a violent encounter, much more than a line in the sand. Comparably, a recurrent theme of American neoconservatives has been their worry about what is happening in Europe in relation to the Islamic immigrant communities. These conservatives make the argument that Europe is not defending itself against an Islamic onslaught, and that this in turn constitutes a fundamental threat not just to the West, but specifically to the survival of America. So now the positions are inversed and reversed. The old Europe becomes America's new frontier in this new war. This is an important point for two reasons that are central to the question of the relation between Americanism and Islamism. First, what enables Americanism and Islamism as global movements is that this is a post-Europe world, in the sense that World War I marks the moment of Europe's provincialization, the end of Europe as a project of global civilization and redemption. This isn't an absolute end, and the influence of Europe continues to this day, but it atrophies very significantly, including redemption through the project of modern secularization. So you could say that the beginning of post-secularism, if you're thinking about the title of the lecture, lies in World War I and its disruption, though not erasure, of the project of Europe, European modernity, which is also the logic of the nation state. The retreat of Europe leaves room in the first instance for the rise of America and the Soviet Union as quite different global projects, and simultaneously, though for a long time much less visibly, to the rise of other global projects and movements, including theological, political ones, such as liberation theology in the framework of the Cold War. At the same time, precisely because this is a post-Europe world, the encounter of Americanism and Islamism takes place through Europe. Post-Europe, Europe, which is us, that is, Europe after the end of the great project of Europe, though that can shift too, has become a site and object of contestation to which both America and Islamic countries send their religious and political missionaries. Islamic schools and mosques are built with Saudi money, moderate Muslims are recruited by American embassy staff, and both are sponsoring them to take trips to their countries. So what you have then is, at the same time, there's a contestation and a collaboration between America and the Middle East in the disciplining of Europe's Muslims, all of which is precisely possible because Europe doesn't claim these Muslims as its own. If it doesn't want them, there are plenty of others who do. So when we relate Americanism and Islamism to each other, there's the big Americanism and Islamism and the little. That's not very precise terms, but to start with. Big Americanism is the whole constellation of ideologies, culture, products, money, ways of being, etc. In the world that move at multiple levels and in multiple objects, what Arjun Appadurai calls landscapes. The same goes for big Islamism. What I want to look at quickly now is little Americanism and Islamism, and what I mean there are the militantly expansionist versions and groups, particularly neoconservative Bushism and jihadist bin Ladism. What is striking is how similar these are once you compare them to each other. But before I get into that, I want to show two video clips.
فارسنا أبي غريب المكي رحمه الله ببشرى اختياره للقيام بعملية استشهادية ضد السفارة الدنماركية في إسلام أباد، بكى الفارس رحمه الله من شدة الفرح وخر ساجدا لله شاكرا للمولى على هذه النعمة متضرعا له بالدعاء والبكاء سائلا إياه التوفيق والسداد في هذه العملية الاستشهادية. بدأ التجهيز لهذه العملية، وبعد الترصد قرر المجاهدون أن تكون العملية في اليوم الذي تكون فيه أبواب السفارات مغلقة أمام الجمهور، وذلك حرصا على نفاذ المسلمين. وقبل الانطلاق إلى العملية وجه فارسنا رحمه الله رسائله الأخيرة.
أما رسالة الأخيرة إلى عباد الصليب الدنمارك، أقول لهم بإذن الله أنه ليس هذا الانتقام الأول والأخير، وبإذن الله الشيخ أسامة بن لادن من يترككم سدى، والمجاهدين كلهم من يترككم سدى. بإذن الله سنبيدكم عن وجه الأرض ونحذر كل من تسول له نفسه سب النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام أن هذه السيارات فقط مصيره بإذن الله. وفي الأخير أهدي هذا النشيد يا أم الغالية التي بإذن الله تكون بإذن الله أول من أشفع له يوم القيامة إذا الله تقبلني شهيد بإذن الله. اعذريني يا بعد عمر اعذريني وفري زلات عمري وسامحيني مقوى تجرح فؤادك يا فؤادي، لكن الجنة تناديني تبيني، لكن الجنة تناديني تبيني. اعذريني لا تقولني جفيتك كيف نجفى من على الدنيا عويني، كيف نقدر استحل اعبار عيني، كنت يغلى من غلا روحي وعيني، وانت يغلى من غلا روحي وعيني، وانت يغلى من بحب اليوم قلبي، وانت يقدر وقدرت تحتويني. لو تعرفين ايش كثر عن الحقيقة ما قدرت بالحقيقة تعتبيني، ما قدرت بالحقيقة تعتبيني. ملك المسلم تسمى بالسلام والعرب ذي ردة هم نايميني، كما الطفل الصغير وسط الركام وما هالمكلوم تسرق بالمعيني، وما هالمكلوم تسرق بالمعيني. يما مرضى تستمر هذه المذلة، مرضى تفيد لها كبر العيني، مرضى تفيد لها كبر العيني. مبغى 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 حور الطيب أبغى حور عيني، مبغى حور الطيب أبغى حور عيني. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. وأضافت الكافرين، وأوضح وبجلاء أن الأمة الإسلامية
ويردون عن حمى الكفار. نعم، لقد حظيت العملية
Forgot to talk about Pastor Lucy. Yeah, as I was mayor and Pastor Lucy was here, he was praying over me, and you know how he speaks. And he's so bold. He's praying, Lord, make a way, Lord, make a way. And I'm thinking, this guy is really bold. He doesn't even know what I'm going to do. He doesn't know what my plans are. And he's praying not, oh Lord, if it be your will, may she become governor.
She's talking about a Kenyan minister who visited like 10 different times at this church.
Very, very powerful coming from this church. So that was awesome about Pastor Lucy.
But there were some things about the natural resources, about the state. There were some things that God wants to tap into to be a refuge for the lower 48. And I believe Alaska is one of the
lower 48
states in the
states.
last days. And hundreds and thousands of people are going to come to the state to seek refuge, and the church has to be ready to minister to them. Amen?
Time of its darkness. God has a different idea.
God is invading Alaska.
Master's Commission Wasilla, Alaska has one purpose: to know God and to make Him known.
God has a destiny for the state of Alaska.
Master's Commission is one of the keys in God's plan for Alaska, the United States, and the entire world. Master's Commission, Wasilla, Alaska, to know God and to make Him known. God, what's the plan?
What we have was our governor, we gave her one of our diplomas, Master's Commission diplomas, for her to take back.
Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate this. And one last thing, as I travel around the state, it's really cool to visit other communities and visit other churches. And once in a while, a pastor will come up to you before the service starts and says, now I don't know about your background, but you know, we welcome you to our worship service, and don't be surprised if they need a tuition or two, you know, raise their hand clap. And I say, I grew up at Wasilla Assembly of God. Nothing freaks me out about the worship service. So glad. God bless you.
Praise God.
At the very beginning, she was talking about a minister who's, he's a Kenyan who has come there, and there's another clip which I don't have with me that shows, maybe some of you caught it in the news, that he was praying for her to be protected from witchcraft, right? So that's what she was talking about, and that that became controversial. And what she was talking about right now was that he had intervened when she was running for governor. And she was saying he hadn't said, please God, if it be your will. He just stepped in there and said, make way for her, make a way for her, let her be governor. And then she said she became governor, and it sure was a great intervention. So that's who she's talking about at that moment. So what you see here, I mean, there's a lot to talk about these video clips, and I can only talk a little bit, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what happens when you put them next to each other, and then how they're operating on comparable trajectories. They have apocalyptic visions, strongly sustained by religious narratives. They're operating on the immediate margins of established political, religious, and social institutions. The church that you saw Palin in is a church that's it's somewhat controversial. It's a church that's involved in a movement called the Third Wave, where you saw a bit of what the ideology was, which is that there's going to be coming a moment of apocalypse where people are going to be running away, seeking refuge. They do a kind of mapping of the globe where they track where the devil is particularly active, and then are very active themselves in praying and trying to rid those areas of the devil. So they have an apocalyptic vision. They have a vision that's strongly shaped by a very strong sense of there being the devil. And Palin was saying she had grown up in this church, and that nothing much that she would encounter in a church would freak her out because she was used to a lot of different things. Both of these are globally oriented with a strong territorial sensibility, and they're both contested in their respective countries. So a lot of Americans were pretty aghast especially when we saw the videos of Palin with the minister who's driving out and protecting her from the devil. And the funny thing is that he was often called a witch doctor, which he wasn't, of course. So you have this slippage in associating the African minister with the African witch doctor, even though that's in fact what he was contesting. And when he's coming from a village in Kenya where he has been very active in driving out witchcraft and then presenting this eradication of witchcraft as the means to social improvement, to fixing unemployment, alcoholism, theft, all kinds of social instability. So witchcraft, as there was anti-witchcraft and Christian anti-witchcraft, as the means to social and political change. Both of the videos that you see are highly syncretic. They're a mix of genres, styles, narratives, traditions, the blending of the Western and the non-Western. Also, what you should know is that the Salafist, the man, the suicide driver that you saw, and I thought what was funny, I mean, in terms of genres, what you can also be thinking about is, for example, I mean, he looked at the moment, he looks like he's a car salesman, and he's going, you know, look, this great car, right? And then at the same time, I mean, what he is selling, he's selling the jihad, and he's selling the jihad both as a satisfied client, look how happy it's made me, and as somebody who's advertising based on how happy it's made him, how happy it's going to make you if you join the jihad. This comes back in a number of the videos that I've seen. You see a kind of euphoria among the people who are going to be suicide bombers, this great happiness and pleasure, which then is used to sell what they're doing. You have that moment where he sings the song for his mother, and he says at the beginning of that he's going to intervene on her behalf when he gets to heaven. Now that's an approach, an idea that's coming out of Sufi Islam, which Salafists, which is roughly what he's in, they abhor Sufi Islam, but they're taking out elements of it and inserting them into their video, just like they're inserting various kinds of visual elements, like the red flashes around the car, the use of computer graphics. So these things are very, very mixed, not just mixed media, but they're mixed media religiously as well as mixed media in terms of the ways in which they're put together as a video. When you look at when you go beyond the videos and you look organizationally, and I just want to mention this quickly, at what was happening within the Bush camp and what's happening within the Bin Laden camp, you see a lot of the same kinds of problems and organizations. Both of them were relatively isolated and oriented inward. They're very much oriented based on personalities and hierarchies, with little room for critical and democratic discussion of strategies and tactics. Both have significant economic resources that lead them to utterly overestimate the possibility for achieving the goals they set themselves. They're both committed to a conflictual model of the world that leads them to abandon politics for war. They're both enamored of the media and set their goals in terms of achieving media spectacles at the cost of those that they claim to represent. So many of the jihadis, including the Taliban, are very critical of bin Laden, and he's gotten messages from people saying that he's in love with the media and that he should stop making so many media appearances because it is to the detriment of the Taliban, instead to the detriment of Muslims. When he's gotten those, he's ignored them. He's fascinated, and what he wants to achieve is to make a media statement and be a media presence. The same kinds of things you see in when Bush was attacking Iraq and talking about shock and awe and creating a spectacle to match the spectacle of the downing of the towers and the attacks on the Pentagon. Both of them, bin Laden and Bush, thought that the Middle East Muslims would rise in support of them, and both of them were completely wrong. Most importantly, perhaps, both removed themselves from the tradition in order to establish their own circular legal reasoning. And this, I think, is a really important point, that if you look at how is it, because one of the things that's intrigued me is how is it that these things could happen. And you have these two actually very, very small organizations, the bin Laden group and the Bush clique, of neoconservatives who are operating, and they shut themselves off from not only external influences, but also from tradition. Both of them are breaking very, very strongly with tradition, with traditional interpretations of Islam and with traditional interpretations of the American Constitution. And the ways in which they go about that, doing that, are comparable in that both of them set out to establish new laws. So Bush had a small group of lawyers, 2 or 3 lawyers, who were writing new legal findings, which then were not exposed, were actually very carefully guarded so that they couldn't be questioned or investigated. And it was on the basis of these that things like torture and the abolition of habeas corpus and so forth were considered to be legal and acceptable practices, even though these broke the tradition. And the same thing goes with bin Laden, that he's not at all authorized, you've probably heard this many times, that he's not authorized to make religious findings. He doesn't have the knowledge, he doesn't have the training, but that hasn't kept him from making all sorts of religious statements, religious findings, claims, and so forth. So you have, what's really important is that in both cases you have a break with tradition. And I think that that's really important, that if you're looking at Americanism, for example, you have a number of interpretations of what's going on now with America internationally that read it in terms of continuation of American expansionism or a continuation of American race politics. So there's connections that are made between the photos that were taken in Abu Ghraib and lynching photos that have been taken. And to some extent, I'm making that same kind of argument earlier when I was saying you see the externalization of Indian country, you see the externalization of the frontier, you see the whole ambivalence between democracy and terror being transported from the terrain of the United States to someplace like Iraq. So in certain ways you have certain kinds of continuities. At the same time, there's these very, very critical, revolutionary ruptures with tradition that are happening very consciously, that are happening either secretly or semi-secretly, and which now are in the process of being turned back. And I think that's also a very important point, is that to some extent the United States is a self-correcting system. So part of where the Obama surge is coming from is people who are deeply, deeply alienated by what has been happening. So in any discussion about American imperialism, for example, that's a very key point, is that America has also been very critical of imperialism. It's been a very ambivalent imperialist nation. You both have very strong active imperialists and strong anti-imperialists. And the same kind of thing is going on among the Islamists, that bin Laden is part of a whole constellation of jihadist groups. And that in these jihadist groups, there's a lot of debate going on between should they be fighting only their governments or should they be fighting the United States, which is supporting their governments? Should they be fighting the near enemy or the far enemy? Should they be using violence or should they not be using violence, and so forth? And so there's tremendous critique of bin Laden, of his strategies, and the argument that he's really done a disservice to jihadism, that he's done a disservice to Islam, and so forth. So this is something that really doesn't get brought out in the media, but it's important to see that the kinds of developments that we see in recent years are part of a whole constellation of discussions in which one small group for a sudden moment has been able to break out into the global realm. And in the process, on the one hand, externalize, continue a trajectory that's already in place, and on the other hand, really radically break with tradition. Finally, both organizations realize themselves most fully not only through media spectacle, but also through the bodies of their subjects. Just as the bodies of the suicide jihadists are put to the full and ultimate use, what before I was describing as the virtue of self-destructive violence, so the Bush government, though in a very different way, lays similar absolute claims to the bodies of American citizens. And what I'm thinking here is the case of Terri Schiavo. How many of you have heard about that? Okay. So she was a woman who had entered into a coma. She was in a coma for 8 years, and at that point her husband wanted to end her life, and her parents didn't want her to end it. And this went through a series of court cases, and the Bush government came down on the side of the parents and did its very best to keep food from being moved from stopping the process of ending her life, going so far as to have a special meeting of Congress during vacation in order to pass a special law that was only meant for Terri Schiavo. And this is the first time in American history that this has ever happened, that a law has been passed simply for one individual. A few hours after Terri Schiavo died, before she'd been cremated, Bush made a speech. And what he says then is, today millions of Americans are saddened by the death of Terri Schiavo. Nora and I extend our condolences to Terri Schiavo's families. I appreciate the example of grace and dignity they've displayed at a difficult time. I urge all those who honor Terri Schiavo to continue to work to build a culture of life where all Americans are welcomed and valued and protected, especially those who live at the mercy of others. The essence of civilization is that the strong have a duty to protect the weak. In cases where there are serious doubts and questions, the presumption should be in favor of life. The most solemn duty of the American president is to protect the American people. Since September 11th, 2001, we've taken bold and vigorous steps to prevent further attacks and overcome emerging threats. We face a new and different kind of enemy. The threats today are unprecedented. The lives of our citizens are at stake. He continues his speech with a discussion of different kinds of military threats that there are, especially from weapons of mass destruction, and specifically mentions Iraq and Libya and Pakistan. And then he concludes it by saying, remember, we are at war, and that underestimating a threat could be tens of thousands of innocent lives. Bush has effectively linked Schiavo to September 11th. He has shifted bodily integrity into the realm of national security. This, by the way, is the same kind of reasoning that has been used to prevent showing photographs of dead American military. Since the beginning of the war, there's only been 6 photos of dead military that have reached public realm. Integrity itself becomes the right most in need of protection. As Elaine Scarry has noted, quote, situations of sickness, injury, or operation often entail heightened forms of the passive and the active. The patient is in a situation of extreme passivity. The physician or surgeon, extreme activity. Yet it is precisely here, in the injured, sleeping, anesthetized, dying body, that we have the sudden grounding of rights, sovereignty, dignity. The whole issue of consent, by holding within it the notion of sovereignty and authorization, bears within it extremely active powers. Yet it often arises precisely at the point where by any conventional description there seems an extreme of passivity. End quote. It's within the context of discussions of bodily integrity that we see the most overt evidence of the contradiction at the heart of the idea of consent. The politically active, consenting citizen is a meaningful concept only if that citizen is also physically passive or subject to threat. The idea of citizens being fully mature in adult years and of sound mind reinforces this relationship between political identity and biological or physical identity. The discussion of free governments by Justice Edward Brown, which I'll discuss in another area, produces a framework in which to understand it. Taken to its logical conclusion, this analysis produces a situation in which the most politically active citizen, the citizen most capable of consent, is simultaneously the most physically or biologically passive, the most unconscious, or, for that matter, the most dead. Now, this is fascinating what's happening with bodies, especially in relation to the discussion about suicide bombers and the torch at Abu Ghraib. But I also want to think in closing about a couple counter-narratives. That is, if these are kinds of accounts that are being put forward in order to sustain violence, Where can we start looking for a different angle of approach? And there are 3 sides that I want to offer now by way of suggestion. The first one, and I want to mention again here, that these are meant to be complementary to the kinds of policy discussions that there are and so forth. That those are very important, but at the same time, a lot of what's going on has much more to do with unconscious ways of thinking about things, with understandings of national identity, with cultural movements, cultural logics, that cannot be regulated through foreign relations. So, I mean, I don't know, because I'm curious what the discussion is going to be, because in my own work right now, when I'm looking at these discussions are so, what I'm looking for essentially is a bridge between, on the one hand, you have fields of international relations that are looking at these issues, and on the other hand, I'm getting very hoarse here, so I'll stop soon. On the other hand, you have cultural studies. And then the question is, how do you relate the kinds of discussions that you have in cultural studies to the kinds of discussions that you're having in foreign and international relations to each other? So the first entryway that I have is my final video. And this is a music video for a band called Radiohead. And it's the first music video in which that's been completely digitally produced. So the human body itself has never been filmed for this except for digitally filmed. And what you should also know is that the environment that you saw was actually a very boring neighborhood in Florida. And when they were filming this, one of the technicians talks about that this is the area we're going to vaporize. And so I was very struck in how they were talking about it and what they were doing with the faces and the digitalization of the faces and of the neighborhoods. And that there's an ambivalence in that term in vaporizing it, because of course in some sense it sounds rather militaristic. And at the same time it touches on what I think that there's a long desire in Western and modern culture for desiring to be completely consumed by experience. and that this exists in tension with the desire and assertion of sovereignty. So one of the things I find really interesting is this tension between the desire to be subsumed, to be consumed, and the desire to be absolutely expressed, absolutely sovereign, and then the question coming out of that, what is the relation between these two? When we're thinking about issues on one hand of terrorism, of national identity, and on the other hand, what this song it happens to be about, which is love. And it's this love is one of the places in which this has been thought about most often, I think. So it's appropriate. It's a love song, and at the same time, this is a song. I have the lyrics with me, but it's a love song. Actually, it's somebody who's asking somebody to leave their husband and come with him. So it's a love song about the possibility of love rather than an actual consummated relation, and the ways in which that possibility of love can be more consuming and absolute even than the everyday practice of love. The second example I have as a potential entryway is a different kind of love affair. This is a much older one. This is from Shaykh Ahmed al-Asai, who's an early 19th century Shiite scholar. And he was someone who excelled at doing very rational analyses of very tricky kinds of legal, theological questions. And at the same time, he was somebody who emphasized the importance of scripture and also of mystical illumination. So it was somebody who combined rationality with mysticism. And he put a big emphasis on visions, on the impact of divine light on the heart of the believer, and on achieving spiritual perfection. And this is one of the things that's very distinctive about him. And if you look at that spiritual dimension, he is somebody who had a lot of dreams when he was a young man. And there's a disciple of his, Sayyid Qasim Rashdi, who tells what one of these dreams was. And he says, he saw our Lord Hassan in a dream, and the Imam put his tongue in his mouth and shared with him his saliva, which was sweeter than honey and more fragrant than musk, but burning hot. His longing grew so extravagant, his love so overwhelming, that he forgot to eat or drink, imbibing just enough to stay alive. He left off mixing with the people, and his heart cried and oriented itself toward God. And then he had a true vision of the messenger of God, who gave him to drink of his saliva, which tasted and smelled like that of the Imam, but was icy cold. When he regained consciousness, the flames within him had subsided, and loving kindness descended upon him. He learned from them knowledge and enigmas, and dawning rays of light shone over the horizon of his heart. This new knowledge did not derive only from his visions, but rather when he awoke, he began finding evidence for it in the Quran and in the sayings and deeds related of the Prophet and the Imams. So Sayyid Qasim, the student, the disciple, was careful to insist that the Shaykh's visions were congruent with the holy law and scripture. But a good deal of his charismatic authority came from these visions rather than simply from his mastery of the textual. These and other visions reported by the Shaykh are powerful in their symbols, and they derive some of that potency from the homoerotic imagery, though at the same time lived like the Shaykh, who was very much married and very heterosexual. The implicit gender opposition is clear. Broadly speaking, from a male point of view, mystical ecstasy is male and oral, in implicit contrast with carnal ecstasy, which is female and genital. At the same time, within the visions, there's another opposition. The lesser figure, the Imam, the first one he encounters, inspires with his burning saliva a spiritual restlessness and asceticism, while the higher figure, the Prophet himself, bestows through his icy cold saliva a radiant acquiescence and mystical gnosis. The effect of the imagery in these visions, the bodily intimacy with the fluids of exalted and holy personages, is to highlight the Shaykh's special link with the next world in an audacious and concrete way. At the same time, in lived life, the Shaykh went to live in a provincial town, though he was invited a number of times by the ruling authorities, precisely in order to keep his complete independence from state interference. In this way, he ensured the sovereignty of both his body and his theology. Now I want to put this tradition, this was a very influential sheikh among the Shiites, I want to put this tradition and these visions next to those of another man, an Americanist, 19th century intellectual, the incomparable Walt Whitman. And it should be clear probably why I'm choosing him. And so he's my final third entryway. And one of the things that Walt Whitman, he's very known for his Leaves of Grass and for his homoerotic poetry and the kinds of problems which this caused him in life. And maybe, yeah, he's also known as a strong Americanist. And he says, I believe the main purpose of these states is to found a superb friendship, exalted, previously unknown, he says in his poem To the East and West. I perceive that it waits and has always been waiting, latent in all men. If America is to construct an unforeseen democracy, the citizens have to create a previously unimagined friendship. They have to sing songs of manly attachment. Individuals have to discard the whole past theory of their lives, abandon all conformity to the lives around them, and so forth. In natural environments, Whitman says, the organic homoerotic love that was latent in all men might manifest itself. And then this is a poem of his. Here to put your lips upon mine, I permit you, with the comrade's long-dwelling kiss of the new husband's kiss. For I am the new husband, and I am the comrade, or if you will, thrusting me beneath your clothing, where I may feel the throbs of your heart or rest upon your hip. By refusing to specify the sex of the partner who holds his hand, who kisses him, upon whose hip he rests, Whitman approaches what Robert Martin calls the socialism of non-directed sex. Such a strategy implies an artificially delineated heterosexuality is undemocratic because it restricts the natural expression of love and pleasure solely to male-female relationships and prevents its fair exchange between same-sex partners. Democracy could not make distinctions of any kind, particularly when it comes to sexual matters. As the natural expression of love, homosexual contact, particularly Whitman's construction of it, has the potential to blur class distinctions and to merge the bodies of political equals, in this case white men, together in a mutual exchange in the mutual exchange of pleasure that brings about an unprecedented democratic union of the body politic. As he explains in his preface, the special meaning of this group of poems resides in its political significance. This beautiful and sane affection of man for man, and what goes directly and indirectly with it, would bind the United States of the future into a living union. Only when any two natural and nonchalant persons passing leisurely on the street were willing to kiss one another on the lips with robust love would the friendships needed for democracy be forged. This is a deeply Americanist call for revolutionary kissing in the interests of a new body politic. Who knows, now in ending, if Bush and Bin Laden would kiss and recognize their kinship, maybe the world would be a much better place. More seriously, I'd like to find a way of linking, I'd like to find a way of linking this kind of discussion to the other kinds of discussions, like I've been saying at different points in the course, to the discussions that we're having about international relations, about politics, about the ways in which terrorist networks function. And I'm very curious what your thoughts are about this and the kinds of thinking that you've been doing about America and